1347 AD, Europe fell to its knees as death swept through the streets. The Black Death, they called it. But to me, it was personal. My name is Isabella, and I lived to tell the tale of survival when hope had all but vanished. Florence was everything to me. Its streets were full of music, laughter, and life. I had a small but beautiful home with my husband and daughter. We weren't wealthy, but we had love, which in those days felt like more than enough. I spent my days selling herbs and remedies in the market, my husband crafting fine furniture. Life was simple, peaceful, and full of promise. But peace, I would learn, is the most fragile thing in the world. I longed for a better life for my daughter, Katerina. She was only 8, but I dreamt of a future for her beyond Florence's walls, a life filled with knowledge, opportunity, maybe even wealth. There were whispers of trade from the east, of fortunes to be made. I could see it, our family growing prosperous, leaving behind the struggle. But fate has a cruel way of twisting dreams. In the fall of 1347, the first death struck. A boy, no older than Katerina, collapsed in the market square. His mother screamed, but no one dared approach. Word spread fast, a new disease, a curse sent by God himself, the Black Death. It came silently, like a shadow creeping through the streets. First a cough, then the fever, and within days, black sores covered the skin. People died so quickly. Within a week, our neighbors were gone, entire families wiped out. My hands trembled as I held Katerina close, praying to a God who had gone silent. The plague found us. My husband was the first. I saw the fear in his eyes as the fever took him. His skin turned black, his body convulsing in agony. There was nothing I could do but watch. And then it was Katerina, my little girl. She cried for me, but I couldn't touch her. I couldn't hold her, knowing the plague was already inside her. Her cries echoed in my mind as I closed the door to her room, sinking to the floor, helpless. I had never felt so powerless, so broken. By the end of the week, I buried them both in a shallow grave behind our house. There were no priests left to give last rites, just silence and sorrow. I knew I had to leave. The city was a graveyard, and the longer I stayed, the more death seemed inevitable. I joined a group of people fleeing Florence, hoping to find safety in the countryside. We moved in silence, our faces covered with cloth to protect us from the death lingering in the air. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every stranger was a risk. I could feel my heart racing constantly, wondering if it was already too late for me. Surviving wasn't free. The countryside, which we believed would save us, was just another nightmare. Villages stood empty, death seeping from every abandoned home. Hunger gnawed at us constantly, and the cold nights stole our strength. We huddled together, whispering prayers for mercy, but fear twisted us into something unrecognizable. Trust became a luxury none of us could afford. One night, a woman in our group coughed, a sound so small yet it exploded in our minds like a thunderclap. Panic swept through us instantly. We stared at her in horror, no words needed. It was the plague. It had to be. The group turned on her, just as we had turned on anyone who showed the slightest sign of illness. She begged us, pleaded that it was just the cold air, but none of us were willing to take the risk. We forced her to leave, driving her into the darkness with nothing but her terror for company. Was it the right thing to do? It didn't matter. All that mattered was that we stayed alive, no matter the cost. Every step forward after that night felt heavier, like the weight of our actions clung to us. We had survived, but with each person we lost, whether to death or fear, we became less human. Survival was no longer about living, but about outlasting the horror around us. Months later, I returned to Florence, but it wasn't the city I had known. The once bustling markets were empty, the streets lined with the bones of the dead. My home was gone, collapsed, consumed by the plague and neglect. I wandered through the ruins of my old life, hollowed out, a shadow of the woman I once was. The city had survived, but it was as broken as I was. I reopened my herb stall, but what was the point? I had no family left to provide for, no dreams to chase. But in the ashes of the old world, something strange began to happen. People started to return, rebuilding, planting seeds in the scorched earth. I realized then that, like me, they had survived not because they had hope, but because there was nothing else. I had been shattered, my heart ripped apart by the plague, but I had learned a truth that would stay with me forever. Life goes on, even in the face of death. The plague had stolen my future, but it couldn't take away my will to live. The Black Death tried to take everything from me. It took my family, my home, my dreams, but it couldn't take me. I survived, and in the end, I learned that even when the world falls apart, we find a way to keep going. Because sometimes, survival is the only victory we have left.